Good morning, everybody. Thank you for jumping on the webinar today about NFPA 70E compliant electrical safety programs. Now, I will make a note, this is a crash course. There is a lot to creating electrical safety programs, but we're gonna dive into what the 70E requires and try to bridge the gap between what the standard says versus how that actually works in a workplace.
Sure.
We'll see how that goes. Like I said, crash course. So
yeah.
we will just get this rolling here. First off, I do want to make sure for those of you who just logged in, go ahead and find that question feature. That's how you can interact with us during today's webinar. So if you have any questions or comments or feedback, definitely feel free to type it up and send it through that box, that question feature or chat box. That way we can address your questions as we go. I try to monitor it on the screen over here while we are presenting.
Yeah.
Okay, without further ado, my name is Caitlyn Wininger, and I am a CESCP through NFPA with an electrical engineering degree. Been with Herzig for a number of years, and my entire job is based on safety trainings and safety programs and all that stuff. So I can definitely attempt to answer any question that comes my way. And if I don't know the answer, you better believe I'll find it.
Sure. I'm James Wininger. I'm a licensed professional engineer in Missouri and some other states. Also have a double E. Caitlyn and I actually went to school together. I think most of you that attend these webinars already know that.
Yeah.
But I perform arc flash studies. I assist with the infrared service and preventive maintenance at Herzig, as well as manage the team to help support the engineers.
Right. And some people consider those separate initiatives, but in reality, they go hand in hand.
Right.
So first off, I do have a poll question for you guys. So it should be popping up in here just a second. Do you have an ESP? And here's the kicker. Are you confident it's compliant and relevant to your workplace? So kind of three questions in one. Do you have one? Is it compliant? And is it relevant?
Good question to ask.
One of the three being no. So yes, you think you've got it covered, specific to your workplace. No, missing some aspects. Or you're just simply not sure, or you don't have one. Those are the options. So go ahead and click and submit whichever option makes the most sense for you. All right. Got a lot of people feeling pretty confident about their program, which is good. I'm glad to see that.
That is good.
And then the other half or so, not so much, which fair, right? Got to learn. Okay, I'll just give it about 10 more seconds. I'm only going to leave them open for like a minute.
Okay.
Just so that people have a chance. Select that option, get it submitted, and I'm going to go ahead and close this out. All right, so pretty big split between all three of them, actually. So 35% of you feeling pretty good, confident about your program. That's great. Hopefully we can still feel that way after we cover this, right? And then the rest of you guys, no worries, totally understandable. This is kind of a niche area, niche area. And so that's why we help with this kind of stuff. Okay. We are going to cover, first off, what are the actual electrical regulations, codes, and standards to have a compliant electrical safety program? What do you need to reference?
Yeah.
And then we'll dive a little bit deeper into one specific, the main one, the NFPA 70E. In Article 110.3, it lists the bare minimum requirements that have to be in your program. So I'm going to try to break that down for you. Oh, one of them didn't finish popping up. Okay. How to get started revamping your ESP is how we'll wrap up, kind of just some initiatives that you should be able to start today. And then if there are any questions left over at the end, we'll try to address them before we wrap up for the rest of the webinar.
Yeah.
All right, so let's get into it. What are the actual regulations, codes, and standards that need to be referenced or at least considered in your safety program?
Sure. So we have the trifecta here of codes and standards. We've got the NEC, the NFPA 70B, and the NFPA 70E. The 70E or the NEC covers the installation requirements for compliant or competent individuals only. The NFPA 70E obviously covers electrical safety requirements that we'll primarily be talking about today.
Yeah.
The NFPA 70B, we've done a webinar over that before. that'll be brought up a little bit during this simply because it's tied into the others.
Right. Yeah, all three of them do work together. We do focus a lot on the NFPA 70E, that bottom left one. But the other two are very, very important to having a compliant safety program as well.
For sure.
Install it right, maintain it well, and have your people work on it safely.
Right.
Okay.
So there's some confusion between where OSHA gets tied up in all this.
Had a lot of questions.
Yeah. OSHA recognizes arc flash and electric shock as workplace hazards. They also require employers to understand the industry standards and protect workers, such as understanding the NEC 70E and the 70B.
Yes.
Failure to meet any of the NFPA 70E standards could be cited by OSHA within their regulations of their subchapter S.
Right. So they don't enforce NFPA codes and standards necessarily, but they do understand their value. Okay. It's a wonderful resource, and so they highlight it quite a bit. For
sure. And to give you some specific verbiage on OSHA, they said in their own interpretation of this that OSHA may use NFPA 70E to support citations for violations relating to certain OSHA standards.
Right. It takes a long time to get an OSHA reg updated. And if you notice, previous editions of the NFPA 70E may or may not have the exact same verbiage as some of that regulation in OSHA for the electrical standards. That's because they're trying to adopt the NFPA 70E into regulation. It just takes a while. So 70E gets updated way more often than the OSHA does. OSHA regs do. So
government runs a little slow.
Just a bit. Sometimes, yeah.
So the NFPA 70, what is its purpose? Obviously, it tells you, right, in 90.2, the purpose of it is to provide a practical, safe working area for employees relative to the hazards arising from the use of electricity.
Right. And we are on the 2024 edition in case anybody hasn't updated their document yet. Now is the time. So those of you who said, yes, you're good, it's compliant, have you updated it to 2024 yet? That's my question to you. All right.
So the NFPA 70E is the consensus standard for electrical safety. It was created in 1979 as an aid to OSHA for safe work practices, consistent with the National Electrical Code.
Right.
And some more interpretations for you on what specifically OSHA tells us is that OSHA views the 70E as the primary consistent standard addressing electrical hazards.
Right. So I know we've covered this topic plenty of times before, but I've dug a little deeper and found actual OSHA verbiage rather than trying to summarize, because I still get questions about it. And I'm like, all right, this is from OSHA, no question. They see 70E as the primary consensus standard for electrical safety. There is no question. Okay. So in the NFPA 70E, now that we've established it really is needing to be followed, it requires employers to have an electrical safety program. In 105.3, which is a little bit before where we're going to be diving in, establish, document, and implement the safety-related work practices. And it needs to be in line with the 70E, right? You can go above and beyond, but these are the minimum requirements. And then provide training, okay? Because the employee responsibility is to comply with those safety-related work practices. And how can they do that unless they have been trained to do so? All right, so this is where I see a breakdown a lot of times whenever I talk about electrical safety programs. You might have it, you may feel like it's really up to date and it's thorough, but maybe you haven't trained on it.
Okay.
All right, so maybe you've just done what I would consider basic electrical safety or like a generic electrical safety training. Yeah, that probably gets you most of the way, but do you have some specific work practices in your safety program that they probably need to know as well? Like, okay, it says bare minimum, you need to be trained this often, but your policy says you also do a refresher every year. Do you do that? Stuff like that. So question here, if you have an ESP, have your workers been trained on the safe work practice specific in your ESP? Yes, trained on our ESP and it's compliant with the 70E. Yes, trained on our ESP, but may not be compliant. Like, you know, maybe it has some gaps. No, you've done the basic electrical safety only, which that's better than nothing. I'm not going to say no to that. Or no, that just simply have not had electrical safety training yet. And I put yet because well, we're gonna hope that everybody does it if they know that they need it, okay?
Yep.
And this one's a pretty big split as far as the answers here. So I'll give it maybe about another 10 seconds because I was talking whenever I launched it, so. All right. Here we go. Yeah, pretty big split here. So
Wow.
21% though, trained
Yeah.
on ESP, and they believe it is compliant with 70E. That is amazing. I applaud you. Trained on ESP, but may not be 36%. That's fair. That's actually a bigger section than I thought. I thought the last two would have more than the first two.
Yeah.
Frankly. So this is encouraging. I'm really glad to see this, guys.
For sure. It's got the majority.
Yeah. All right, so let's dive in here. Now that we've introduced the topic, we've set the groundwork that yes, this is needed. Here's why, here's how. Well, now here's how, I should say.
Sure.
Okay, so let's get this going. In Article 110.3, which is what we're really highlighting here, in the 2024 edition of the 70E, it states that employers shall implement and document an overall safety program to direct activity appropriate to the risk associated with electrical hazards.
Mm-hmm.
And then it has some informational notes. Actually, there's 4 of them, but I only put 2 of them on the slide here about what kinds of things go into the safety program, and that they have an informative annex that you can look to help implement a safety program. It gets you started. Okay, so for example, kind of summarizing what those entail, we've got the management commitment, organization support, electrical safety policy, energized work permit. Even if you have a policy stating that you don't do energized work, which everybody should have that policy, you still have to have the permit for that what if rare scenario that it truly would be justified. It's a requirement. Training and qualifications of personnel, that is one of the trickiest parts of compiling an electrical safety program, is actually figuring out the nitty-gritty behind qualifications and what kind of training they have to reach those qualifications and auditing requirements.
Okay.
We did a whole webinar about that.
Yeah.
But I know it gets confusing for a lot of people. Use of protective tools, equipment, protective methods, use of electrical equipment, again, going back to the installation and maintenance of it, making sure that you're using it properly as well.
Right.
Authorization, who's in charge of signing off on who does what, when, and where, and why, right?
Are they qualified?
Are they qualified to make that call? That's also very important.
That's a big one I see.
Yeah. Documentation, of course, oversight and auditing, technical support, and emergency preparedness. So whenever it comes to electrical safety, there are some additional considerations for emergency response, because you don't actually want to just jump in and help them, because you may get hurt as well. And I know that a lot of emergency response training say that you should assess the situation first, but they don't always cover what to do if you're not sure if there's current flowing through that person or the ground around them. What do you do? How do you handle that? Because you don't want to just leave them there, but you don't want to step in that area and end up getting hurt too. Anyway,
right.
So that should also be documented in your safety program, some guidelines, some steps that they should be following, and of course trained over. So I've taken a snippet of some table of contents here. This is just an example. Doesn't mean that it's going to apply to your specific facility, but this is a sample of what I've done in the past to help people out. Introduction, principles, responsibilities, difference between unqualified and qualified workers, their training requirements, understanding what the electrical hazards are and how to perform risk assessments, what PPE to wear when,
right.
Warning labels, breaking down how you select your PPE, the boundaries, test instruments, tools, de-energized versus energized work. I mean, all of this stuff is written out in a way that really, if you sat down and read it, it's not going to be hard to understand how to follow. Not just copy paste from the 70E talking about each of these topics, but okay, how does this apply to my workplace?
Right.
That's the difference between opening the 70E and opening your safety program.
It's kind of custom tailored to.
At least it's supposed to be.
Okay.
But it continues on. Okay, there's a bunch of stuff. The appendices I usually use for like the different forms and summaries and checklists and things, reference documents, stuff like that. But in this example, it's 82 pages long. Now, some of you may be looking at that and go, huh, that's overkill. All right, well, half of that is actual text that I would consider required. So about 40 pages, and then the rest are things that are good references, or like I said, forms. And so maybe you have a different document management system to where it wouldn't be all in one document. But just to give you an idea, this takes a lot of effort, which is my point right there.
Yeah,
There's a
you go.
lot to it. Okay. So in addition to just having a safety program, what kinds of things go into it? Again, it's more than just the safe work practices for workers, right? We talked about this NEC and the 70B also play a part.
Right. So inspecting the equipment once it's been installed to make sure that it's installed per code and standards is a really big one.
Yeah.
Condition of maintenance obviously should be included in the ESP. As an example of that, I would say torque values that
Sure.
you find in the 70B now. If you don't have the manufacturer's documentation on that, you can use what's in the 70B, but obviously this is required in the NEC as well. But what I see typically is when equipment that's installed, within the first week, they do a run back through to make sure all the torque values
Yeah.
are in place, and typically come back within 6 months to ensure those torque values are in place.
Sure. So that could apply to modified equipment too.
Yep.
You know, if you've made modifications, you should be going back and checking, for example, your torque values.
That just simply has to do with what's called metal relaxation.
Sure.
So, yeah.
But yeah, that condition of maintenance, I think people understand that it needs to be installed right. It doesn't always happen, but the National Electrical Code's been around as a code for a very, very long time. So I don't think people are surprised at the idea that you have a certain way that you're supposed to be installing it. But the condition of maintenance piece, and we did a whole webinar about it, but the NFPA 70B is now a standard, in case you missed it, as of 2023. And so, yes, condition of maintenance, it's not just a process issue. It's a people issue. It's a safety issue.
Right.
Okay, so just as a little fun note, let's go through some examples of things we've seen in the field.
Okay. Oh, goodness. Well, it looks like these are all new to me, so making it fresh, right?
Yeah.
So it looks like there's some tape over a cover here. That's not UL listed or manufacturer recommended space filler there. So
wait, instead of a breaker blank, you can't just use electrical tape? Oh, learn something new every day. All right, what about this one?
Well, the screw is a part of the equipment. If it's not screwed in, then the installation is incomplete.
Compromised.
Also, the feeders directly behind the screw, that also comes into question the installation.
Yeah, I'd be kind of hesitant to know what's behind that door.
Yeah, especially with the skull and bones.
I know.
My goodness.
It's like, all right, obviously, maybe not obviously. There is clearly some sign that it was not installed or modified appropriately.
Right.
Okay.
Oh,
not uncommon. I do see other comments on here, by the way. I will circle back on those.
The lug is in the different direction. So directly tapping into a conductor obviously is not a good idea. Do not do this.
No.
Look, at least they've got the local disconnect up there, but they have copper exposed. So again,
the little wire nut.
this is just, it's unbelievable.
Yeah, I mean, that exposed energized parts, because that screw, also not supposed to do that anyway, and it's resting up against the back of that panel. And if that screw goes all the way through, hey, guess what? The panel's energized now. I mean, there's all sorts of reasons not to do this, and yet we see this happen.
Yep. Primary reasons why you should cover fixing things like this in your program.
Exactly.
Okay. Got some stray current, some grounding issue there.
Yep.
Did you say there was a video with this?
Yeah. So pro tip.
Okay.
Whenever you come across stuff like this, your electrical safety program, I think, should be written in a way that, you know, if you find evidence of impending failure, which this clearly is, that you should go shut it down, that you should immediately start the process of making it safe, right?
I see how you're lining this up right now.
And I understand sometimes people, you know, they can get their phone out because they want to document what's going on while somebody else is starting the shutdown procedure. Fine. I know for a fact that wasn't the case here. So if you're by yourself and you see something like this, don't be like this gentleman and pull your phone out and start recording and open the door.
Right.
To see what's going on inside. And
typically what you would do
you're on fire.
is try to shut the equipment down as soon as possible.
Yeah.
That's feeding that.
Yeah. So another point, that whole case is energized.
Right. Which would mean you're within the boundaries.
Yes. Was this person wearing the right shock and potentially arc flash PPE?
You would hope so.
I would hope so.
They were within 12
They were
inches.
very comfortable getting that close to glowing red equipment and then a little fire.
Yeah.
Right? But you can't take anything for granted.
I would not feel comfortable getting close to what I refer to as imminent failure.
No. So in an electrical safety program, yes, electrical equipment maintenance, the condition of that equipment, it matters.
Right. Following the NFPA 70B can drastically reduce your risk.
Absolutely. All right, moving right along, 110.3D. If you have your NFPA 70E, you're going to note that we are just going through A, B, C, D. We are going through 110.3 for you. So this one is awareness and self-discipline. Essentially, your electrical safety program should have a reference to explain what those potential hazards are and understanding what happens with them, why they're hazards, where the boundaries are, things like that, and making sure that only qualified personnel are the ones working on equipment that could involve these hazards. That's where the awareness and self-discipline comes in. So safety principles, controls, if you work involving electrical hazards, that's considered qualified, okay? You have to be a qualified person.
Yeah, we also say self-discipline too, because awareness falls under human error.
That's also true, yeah. So it does cover all three, electric shock, arc flash, and arc blast. I make this a point because more and more recently, arc flash has been getting the spotlight, which is good because it's not as understood even today. But electric shock is falling to the wayside as a result. Don't neglect electric shock. It hurts and kills people way more often. I mean, it's a daily thing versus arc flash. Now, arc flash events tend to be quite a bit more severe. So I'm not saying drop that initiative either. Right. I'm just saying don't lose focus on what we already knew was an issue by trying to address this relatively newer one. It's not new, but I'm just comparatively.
Don't shift the focus, share the focus.
There, I like that. Yeah. Share the focus, not shift the focus. Okay. And that's part of being qualified as well, is being able to identify the hazards and reduce that associated risk for shock and arc flash, having knowledge of the equipment, and demonstrating their skills, which is a part of the safety program. I'll circle back to that later, but just so you know, that's the definition of a qualified person, even though I kind of jumbled around it.
Yeah.
All right. So E, F, and G, they're very similar.
Okay.
There's a lot of ways that you can approach this. In Informative Annex E, they have some examples, and I'm about to pull those up and show you. But having principles, controls, and procedures, typically the principles guide what the fundamental goal of your safety program is. The controls are how you plan on addressing those principles, and then the procedures are like the in the moment, how are you going to implement those controls to follow your principles? Does that make sense? They kind of go hand in hand. Yeah. That's why I put them all together. Sure. So for example, in Informative Annex E, and I'm now realizing that's a little small, but you will be getting the slides. Had a question about that, Dottie. I didn't overlook you. You will be getting the slides so you can review it later. Also, just get the 70E. Go to Informative Annex E. You can see it right there. Yeah. So inspect and evaluate equipment, maintain it, plan every job, de-energize if possible, anticipate unexpected events, such and so forth.
Sure.
Okay, and then the program controls. How do you address those principles, right? So procedures to identify the hazards and develop job safety plans to eliminate those hazards. So it said plan every job, okay? Have a job safety plan form to identify those hazards and control the risk. You see how those go hand in hand? Yep. And then for the last one, procedures, okay, how do they actually fill out that job safety plan? Who's doing what, how, what makes them qualified, right. Limits of approach, that kind of stuff, okay? So that needs to be in there as well. The problem is you can't document a step-by-step procedure for everything a worker is ever going to face in their career. So that's where 110.3H fills in any potential gaps of stuff that you just, you know, it's off the wall stuff. Yeah. You know, you can't always plan ahead, you know, years and months in advance to handle risk. Okay. So what is a risk assessment? Whoops, click in here.
Click.
Go ahead.
Well, the elements of a risk assessment procedure are to identify the hazards, which would be arc flash, electric shock in this case, assess the risks associated with those, and then implement risk control methods according to the hierarchy.
Right.
Also, we've talked about human error as well. It's kind of a big, almost the biggest thing to consider in your risk assessment procedure.
This is where training becomes so important.
Right.
Having a great document is one thing. Having people who understand it and follow it is a totally different thing.
Right.
And maybe it's not even your qualified person. Maybe it's the rest of the work crew or the office employees or the public.
Yeah.
Human error is an issue no matter who you are. I think we can all agree we're not perfect. We make mistakes. Sometimes we get in our own little bubble and don't even realize that there's a hazard there because that's not our job. Why are we worried about it? And so human error needs to think about not just the worker, but everyone around you too. How can you limit the effects of human error for those negative consequences? Okay.
Okay. So this is the table we like to use during our risk assessment procedure.
Yeah.
When we look at a specific task to take place, we look at the severity of it and the likelihood of occurrence. And based on those results, you get a risk rating at the top. And then at the bottom left, you could determine whether that task is acceptable, has an acceptable risk to take or an unacceptable risk.
Right. So whenever you look at this risk rating chart, I think there's really two ways to use it. There's the one that I think most people think of is you approach the task and you think, okay, how likely is this to hurt me? How bad would it be if it did? Even if it's improbable, how bad would it be? And then even if the severity is negligible, how likely is it to happen? And then they figure out what to do from there. There's another way to use this though that I think safety professionals are more familiar and comfortable with, where you go through ahead of time. You try to kind of audit your facility, audit your work practices and procedures, and assign a risk rating just kind of as a baseline so that if it does end up being an elevated risk, you can do some of the more effective risk control methods that take advanced planning.
Sure.
All right. So I would say it can go both ways because you're supposed to use the hierarchy of risk control methods using the most effective first, but the most effective takes advanced planning and investment.
Sure.
Okay.
Well said. So the hierarchy of risk control methods are elimination, substitution, engineering controls, awareness, administrative controls, and PPE. The first three have to do with risk control methods directly at the source, while the latter three are outside of the direct source of the hazard.
Right. A lot of times, like I was just saying, the first three, they take that advanced planning, investment, and preparation.
As far as their effectiveness, it goes from top to bottom.
Right. So the most effective take sometimes the most initial effort. And then the awareness, administrative controls, and PPE is about making sure that your people are qualified and that there's the proper signage. And then administrative controls is, and signing off on permits. And then PPE being the last line of defense because it requires a person to wear it properly every time before they need it. That's a lot of possible gaps, right? So always work top to bottom if you can. A lot of the time in the field, I see people jump straight to the awareness piece because they don't have the time to address the first three. That's why I make the point that you really should be starting these risk assessments ahead of time. And that's another initiative in your safety program that you could outline.
For sure.
Okay, so whenever I talk about going in the moment, doing your risk assessment and thinking about how you're going to address that risk for that task, really what I'm talking about is job safety plan anyway. The difference is you actually write it down. So in 110.3I, right, so we just talked about risk assessments, now we talk about documenting it. Job safety plan and job briefing needs to be done before each job that involves exposure to electrical hazards. Not before each job that involves energized adjustment or servicing. That's a permit. Job safety plan is before you open it up, before you get troubleshooting, before you visually inspect it. A job safety plan needs to be done before you're exposed to the hazards. because PPE and boundaries and all that stuff still apply, even if you're just opening it up to look at it, right?
Yep.
So you have to think about that stuff.
Right.
In 110.3I1, the job safety planning part, of course, I think it all makes sense, needs to be completed by a qualified person,
Yep.
someone who knows what they're looking at. Does need to be documented because we live in a world that if it's not documented, it didn't happen, okay? And include what you're doing, what are the hazards associated, what's the risk associated with each hazard,
Right.
and how you're going to address that risk. Work procedures, special precautions, energy source controls, and the emergency response plan.
Yep.
Again, there's additional steps whenever it comes to electrical emergency response, so that should be thought out ahead of time. In informative Annex I, they do have an example job safety planning checklist. You don't have to use this, but it is a good starting place if you don't already have a similar form in your safety program. It's a lot of yes/no questions. It looks like a lot of reading, but in reality, if you can answer these questions and you've thought ahead a lot of this stuff already, it goes pretty quick. Yep. You just have to get familiar with it. So shock information, arc flash information, energy source controls, and then if there's any other specific work procedures that your specific task requires, not just electrical wise, that also needs to be considered.
Yeah. It's really nice they provide you that.
Oh yeah, it's a good launching place. Instead
of starting from scratch.
If you've never spent time in the, I would say informative, if you've never spent time in the informative annex section of the NFPA 70E, you're doing a disservice to yourself and your organization because they have so many resources there.
Right.
And then 110.3I2, so we plan it, now we brief. We have to be able to talk through this job safety plan with anyone involved. Again, that's part of your electrical safety program requirements. And they even have a briefing checklist. It would make sense that you just review the planning form, but sometimes, maybe just pulling up a briefing checklist for these major hazards they put in here, or major considerations, I should say, that is enough. I see people overcomplicate job safety plans and briefings all the time because they try to use one form to fit everything. But if you have simple and routine tasks, some of that information can be just kind of pre-filled in, and then you check yes or no if that still applies, and it at least slows the qualified person down to make sure that they considered those things without having to physically write it out every time. Yeah. You know what I mean?
Okay.
And then, of course, if there's a change in scope, still talking about job safety plan and briefing, need to review the plan and rebrief if there are any changes to the safe work practices. And then moving on to 110.3J, incident investigations. Not only if somebody gets hurt, but if there's a close call, there should be some process or somebody in charge of investigating that to help mitigate those issues in the future. Okay. And then we've got part K, which I've heard some people argue that lockout, tagout, and electrical safety are two different things. And I'm not sure how, because they tie so closely together. Oftentimes they're two separate program documents, yes, but the initiatives so often go hand in hand because you're not just working with electricity a lot of the times. Maybe you are, I don't know what your role is, but a lot of times there's more than just electricity. So you have to think about the other hazardous energy sources too. Specifically in your safety program though, it does mention lockout, tagout. Do you want to explain why?
Well, all electrical conductors or circuit parts shall be considered energized until verified to be de-energized through the process of achieving an electrically safe work condition.
Yeah. Simply put, there's more steps. Okay, it's not a standard lockout, tagout thing. If you're going to be exposed to those conductors or circuit parts, you have to do what James just said. Yep. Either act like it's still energized, or you complete the process of achieving an electrically safe work condition. Yeah. These steps do need to be fleshed out, explained, detailed in your safety program. This is very important. Yeah. So what are those steps?
So they are determine all sources of electricity, open all disconnecting means, visually verify the disconnects have been opened or released, release stored electrical energy, release or block stored mechanical energy, Oh, there's Lotto. Wow.
Ah, yeah.
We just talked about that.
See, they go hand in hand.
Yep. And then you've got the triple test, live dead, live check, which you need to do Lotto first in order to really do that. And then ground if determined necessary.
Right. So the additional step, a lot of times it's lock it out, tag it out, and then try to turn it back on. That's not good enough, because there are times where there could still be energized parts, but the machine or equipment won't quote unquote turn on or operate because you have a spot welded shut leg, or something happened, there was a fault, and so the equipment doesn't run, but it is still energized. So Lotto and trying to turn it back on is not good enough whenever it comes to electrical safety. You actually have to get the meter out, check on a known source that your meter works, go to the point of work. This is kind of a change in the 70E if you didn't know. It's not just the secondary side of the disconnect. You have to go where that person is going to be sticking their hands. That's where you verify 0 voltage, and then go check a known source again. Okay. And then grounding is more common if you have medium voltage, high voltage systems, but there are some other scenarios where you might need that. Okay. Only done by qualified persons. There's a difference between authorized and qualified. I've seen plenty of authorized personnel who are not qualified. All qualified personnel have to be authorized. So if you know Lotto terms, authorized, affected, qualified versus unqualified kind of goes in a similar fashion. So authorized personnel can lock and tag out equipment, but unless they're also qualified, they can't do the triple test for the live dead live check to verify an electrically safe work condition. Hopefully I'm not talking too much in circles and confusing you, but they are two separate things. All qualified person have to be authorized for Lotto though. That's why this does tie hand in hand in your safety program. Okay. Another note, Article 110.2A says that employers must establish a policy that energized work is last resort. Okay. Electrical work should only be done on de-energized systems. If it's not possible to do that, fine, you go through the whole energized work permit process, but be very careful with that, because if you don't have proper justification, and there are some examples of what would be considered proper justification for energized work, if you don't have that, you're directly violating even OSHA, all right? That you should not be doing energized work unless you have true justification to do so, because energized work is the #1. Servicing, adjusting, maintaining any electrical equipment, 50 volts and above is the cutoff. Energized work is the #1 thing that kills people in the workplace whenever it comes to electricity. So don't do that unless it's justified. All right. Moving right along. So Article 110.3L, there's a section called auditing. So once you have your document, your safety program, having all those things, and then of course it references a bunch of other sections in the 70E to flush out what goes in those sections, you also need to audit this program. It is not a one and done document. Every 3 years, it should be reviewed and more than likely updated. So that is to keep up to date with the latest codes and standards. Again, the 2024 70E is out. It has been for several months, many months, and it is definitely time overdue to go ahead and review and update your program to make sure that it is compliant. The other piece of auditing is the worker audits. So it's the field work audit. This is also part of making sure that they're qualified. They need to be audited every year, not every 3 years, every year, that they are still following the safe work practices specified in your safety program, which again, the safety program needs to be compliant with the 70E. Why? People forget stuff. People get, distracted and invested in their job, and that's what they're really focusing on. Coming up with a way to field work audit can be tricky though. If you don't have your qualifications clearly defined, what are you auditing?
Good point.
Nobody can be expected to be quote unquote qualified to do absolutely everything in the electrical industry. It's just not possible. What are they allowed to do? Where's their stopping point? And within that, what items do you need to check every year? That gets tricky. If you've not fleshed out what truly makes somebody qualified in your company, this is kind of impossible to do, but it is required. So an example form that I've come up with, general electrical safety knowledge. just watching them work. Did they remove all conductive objects, such as jewelry? Do they have a knowledge of when insulated tools are used? Do they even have any? I don't know. Do they know how to release someone who's hung up, which is an annual requirement to be trained on methods of contact release? You know, do they wear the right stuff? Do they understand what GFCIs are? Can they just point at a piece of equipment and say, that's a panel, that's a disconnect? You know, do they know what they're working on? Do they know when energized work permits are allowed versus not? Determine nominal voltages. This is just a little snippet.
Yeah.
You know, boundaries, PPE, all that stuff. And again, this is an audit. This is not a training form. I mean, you can train to this, but when push comes to shove, you should be observing them work and checking pass or fail without prompting them to do these things. Now, if they're failing things and continuing to try to work, intervene. You know, don't let them just continue to work unsafely.
Right.
That's where I added in the corrected column. It's like, all right, intervene, let them know that they need to do X, Y, Z. They did fail that, right? But you can correct them in the moment. And then I put the blacked out sections on the corrected column. If it was something that I felt, now mind you, this is a judgment call, but it's something that I felt was important enough that just correcting in the field wouldn't be enough. Like, yeah, I may do that, but they're not passing this audit if they didn't do it right the first time. They'll have to get retrained and re-audited. Okay. Okay, and then there's also the Lockout tagout program and procedure audit. Because it is so very important to do that electrically safe work condition following a proper lockout tagout program, that's a whole separate audit too. And that's to be done every year.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, looking at the program and procedures, the training, and the execution. So it's often very easy to do parts of the Lotto audit with the fieldwork audit for the qualified person because, well, if you're watching them establish an electrically safe work condition, you can knock off the third point there of worker execution of a Lotto procedure. All right, yeah. So you can kind of combine some of these initiatives. And again, all these audits are required to be documented. Okay. So question now that we've covered the NFPA 70E Article 110.3, that's all it says, 110.3. We covered every section in it. It's pretty short. I tried to give some examples of what to do with those, but it's pretty extensive.
Yep.
And, you know, it's hard to go into too much more detail because it really does need to be specific to your workplace, guys. It needs to be specific to what your guys and gals do as their jobs. What do you supply as far as PPE? What do you or don't you allow them to do? So talking about being in compliance with the 70E is one thing. Making it useful for your workplace takes it above and beyond. Okay. So I've got a question for you here. Last poll question. Now that we've covered Article 110.3 in the 70E, how are you feeling about your safety program? Great, always room for improvement, but we have it covered. Not so great. We need to update and audit our program now. Mm-hmm. Or no ASP is currently in place, but definitely need to get started. How are you guys feeling about your safety program with that kind of crash course of what's required here and some ways to follow that?
Okay, looks like we're getting in some results.
Yeah. Okay. Is there an NFPA, I'm just going to go ahead and read a question here. Is there an NFPA 70E train the trainer option? So we as safety professional have the capability to train our employees when we run numerous shifts at all hours of the night. Yes. Yep, that is something that we can help with. Usually I like to have at least 2 days with whoever your trainer is going to be so that I can go in as much detail as possible about it and then give them a chance to try to give it back to me. And then I give them some feedback. The more time that you invest in, you know, that learning experience, the better. I would say bare minimum 2 days. You're not going to learn everything in 2 days. Right. I'm always on call for questions too after that, just so you know.
Yep.
Okay. All right, let's close this poll out, share the results. Wow. Yeah. So not so great. We need to audit and update our program now is the majority.
Mhm.
All still had 20% say that you have room for improvement, but you've got it covered. You're feeling pretty great about it. That's amazing. I mean, round of applause, you guys.
For sure.
So if you need help auditing or updating your program, or if you don't have one, but you need to get it started, of course, I can help with that. Me personally, I write a lot of safety programs and audit programs. So, but the first thing you really should do is just get started. You got to do something. You got to figure out where you're at. And you can sit here in a webinar and you can kind of make notes about things that you think are work or don't, but go out and audit it.
Yep.
Audit your safety program and your workplace. You'll find two different results. I'm gonna bet, okay?
Right.
Again, even the times that I have somebody send me their safety program and I review it and I'm like, man, this is amazing.
Yeah.
I'm loving this. This covers everything. It goes above and beyond. It covers best practices rather than just minimum requirements. It's very specific about employee roles and what they are and aren't allowed, blah, 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 blah. Loving it. And then I go talk to the workers and one of two things happens. Either they've never seen it, so they have no clue what to do to follow it.
Okay.
Or they've seen it and they've been trained on it, but there is a poor safety culture and so they ignore it. Okay, so audit your program and your workplace. See what current practices are actually being used. Okay, even if you have a great document, maybe make sure that it's being implemented properly.
For sure.
That it's understood. Sometimes the issue is that they're not understanding it as well as you think they may. Okay.
Yeah, so make sure also you have an accurate system study or power system study performed on your electrical distribution system by a licensed engineer.
Mm-hmm.
What that would mean would typically be arc flash and shock hazards, and now what's required in the NFPA 70B. But I'm aware of at least 7 different states state engineering boards, that have required a licensed engineer to perform specifically arc flash calculations. Right. So
it is an engineering.
It is considered the practice of engineering.
Yes, that's what I was trying to say. It's considered the practice of engineering, but 7 states have specifically called out arc flash.
Yes.
Even though arc flash is a.
And that's only based on the research that I've done and some colleagues that have helped me dig into that. So,
okay. Yeah. That's good to know. But yeah, if you're going to have a safety program and train your workers to do things properly, it's kind of hard to do that if you don't even know the severity of your hazards. Okay, We've got a whole bunch of information about that too in other webinars, and you're always welcome to reach out to us. And then, supply the appropriate PPE. Okay, once you know the severity of your hazards, make sure that people are protected from those hazards.
Right.
Right? That's pretty much what it boils down to. And then train them.
Yep. Train and qualify anyone who works on electrical hazards. It's that simple.
Yeah.
Make sure they follow the safe work practices described in the ESP that we've talked about.
Right. In your ESP specifically.
Yes,
yours. Bare minimum, they need to follow the 70E, right?
Mm-hmm.
But how does that apply in your workplace? I think I've said this plenty of times now. It can be a little nuanced. All right. So yeah, audit your program in your workplace, see where you're currently at. Make sure you know what the hazards actually are. Have the PPE to protect from the hazards. And train and qualify your workers to not only use PPE, but all the risk control methods in accordance with your safety program.
Sure.
I have another question here. Patrick was asking, is there a basic audit form? So I'm imagining you're talking about qualified electrical worker, like the field audits where you go around and you ask them or you watch them work and see if they do things right without prompting. If that's what you're talking about, no. 70E doesn't have that. There's no code or standard out there with an actual fieldwork audit form that I've found. I help create them. I have some basic items that I want to include on every form, but I usually include some additional stuff based on whatever their role is. So there's really not a basic one that I'm aware of.
Okay.
Can get you started, but you would need to fill in their qualification information too. And that kind of leads me to the next point. If you do need some help, we've got you covered.
Yep.
We've been down these numerous rabbit holes many times with many companies, not just for electrical safety programs, of course, but for studies, training, lotto, audits, whole 9 yards there. So we can always help. So understanding what's required and why is the first step to achieving compliance, and more importantly, safety. Know what the codes and standards are, dive into the 70E requirements, and then also make it applicable to your workplace. I cannot stress this enough. If you have a safety program that is copy-paste verbiage from codes and standards, it's not really that useful to your workers. And so don't be surprised if you go out and you walk around and you watch them work and they're missing some things, you know?
Yeah.
All right. And with that, we have, wow, we actually timed this one right. We have the final 10 minutes. We always plan on having about 10 minutes for questions and discussions, and then we get long-winded about some topics. So we timed this one right. If you have any questions or comments or want to talk more, this would be the time. Go ahead and type them out in the question feature. Otherwise, thank you so much for attending today. There is a handout portion in your GoToWebinar that you can download the slides from today's presentation. You don't have to wait for me to email it out this time. Sorry about that, guys. So yes, you can go ahead and download it now. It is ready, and that way you have it. So copy of the slides to reference for later, or if you need to talk to people and say, hey, you know, let's work on some of these initiatives. And like I said, if you ever have questions about it, if you're trying to go through this and you're just getting stuck, or you're not really sure how to bridge the gap between requirement versus realistic practice, shoot me an email, give the office a call. You know, we can help. Okay, we'll talk through some of those things for you. Otherwise, I will keep this open for a little while to see if any questions come in. But thank you so much for attending today.
Thanks for stopping by.